Well, I am really delighted to introduce our 30th EPS Prize lecturer, Dr. Clare Sutherland. Clare received her PhD from the University of York and then went to be a research fellow at the University of Western Australia before accepting a senior lectureship at the University of Aberdeen. And now every year, the committee gets to look at the nominations for the EPS Prize lecturer. And let me just remind you that this is for an outstanding scientist who's within 6 years of their PhD at the point of nomination. And I can tell you, as somebody in the second half of their career, that every time we look at these nominations, it's a reminder that you wouldn't get your job if you applied for it today. And indeed, Clare has a long, long list of really impressive publications in the area of face processing. And what really struck me in looking at Clare's body of work is just the breadth, going from developmental to social, evolutionary, cultural, even clinical considerations. And I think, the work is so creative, particularly for somebody so early in their career. And it's easy to understand why the nomination referred to Clare as, quote, one of the most innovative thinkers in her field, and someone who has already made, quote, field-changing contributions. And I think the fact that we've just had such an incredible symposium of researchers who come from around the world to Plymouth to celebrate Clare's work. And of course, we have a sort of an extravaganza of face processing work tomorrow is testament to the value that colleagues hold Clare's work in. So I'm really delighted to have you. We're all really excited to hear what you have to say. And I'll welcome you to the meeting.
Thank you. Gosh, how do you follow that? There's a couple of things I want to outline. First, of course, this is an incredible honour. I think if you told me that I would be standing here when I started my PhD, I just flat out wouldn't believe you. So I'm very sensitive of that honour. And I've been very, very fortunate in my career to have benefited, especially from the vast expertise in face perception, work that goes on in the UK and further afield. And of course, we saw the fantastic array of talks in the symposia earlier. And I want to thank Mila, can't see where she is, there she is, for organising those and for all of the symposia speakers. It was really, really rewarding. So yeah, I want to start by just showing you a face. People are laughing if they recognise my husband. He gave us permission for his image to be used. But my point here is just that if you don't know this person, it's really easy to get a number of different things from a face straight away. So age, gender, but perhaps more subjective judgments too. You might think he looks friendly. And that's what I'm here to talk about to you today. So I'm going to ask the question of why impressions from faces are important. I'll look at cultural, developmental, and individual differences in impressions in the main part of my talk. So why are they important? Well, it might not surprise you to know that more attractive people do better in online dating. Perhaps more surprising, attractiveness can have consequences far beyond online dating, including in really quite profound areas. And I guess that's more striking because these judgments are so superficial. We don't really know anything about the person that we're making the judgment from. It extends beyond attractiveness. So on real financial lending websites, people are more likely to get funded and have better credit ratings. And the effect size in this particular study of having a more trustworthy looking profile picture in this case is actually equivalent to the collateral of owning your own house as security, which I find really staggering. This is a really lovely paper by Anna, who's in the audience too. And she shows why we should all care about this. So more trustworthy looking scientists are perceived by the public as doing better science. And this one gets my goat in two different ways. So first of all, these days we're asked to put a profile picture on everything. Here's just one of our papers. And second, because if you study this field, you have to use your own photograph as an illustration. And so we can't get away from it. And both Andy and I have stories about how the media have used this image, by the way, so you can ask us about that later. So Anna and I are currently following up on this. This is unpublished work where what we were finding is that actually this effect of looking more like a stereotypically good scientist actually also affects students' perceptions of profile pictures attached to real academic papers. So that's, I guess, my pitch for why we should care, but we should also care because these consequences start early. So there's some earlier work here showing that impressions of children can have consequences, both in terms of children who look more attractive and unfortunately children who look less attractive. We've weighed on this too and found that, again, children who look a certain way are treated preferentially. So at this point, I really want to issue a note of caution. This is work that Young-Si Fu and I did together in collaboration, where we ran a meta-analysis looking at how if judgments of trustworthiness are accurate. And our main conclusion from this paper is a really large note of caution, because even if there is some very small correlation, it is not at the level that we should use to make our judgments. So these judgments are not useful in the sense that for any one individual perceiver making any one impression of someone else, it's just not helpful. And that's the main message I give to the public as well. And one reason for this is that any link between some kind of actual behaviour in the world and our perceptions of people can also be explained by things that have very little to do with any kind of ground truth, because we know that there are self-fulfilling prophecy effects that occur, such that, for example, children who are treated a certain way by their teachers might develop differently, might become more confident, and therefore this is a sort of self-fulfilling cycle. It's not always self-fulfilling prophecy, you can find the opposite effect too, but the fact that these effects exist mean that we should treat impressions with a great deal of caution. Okay, so thinking about which impressions are important, and for many of you here, this paper will of course be very well known. I think it's fair to say that Alex Todorov's lab has had a really big influence on the field. So in this paper here, he noted that actually a lot of impressions that we make are highly intercorrelated, and we've seen that in the symposia talks today as well. And so he took advantage of this high intercorrelations and essentially used trait impressions, put them into principal components analysis, and boiled down the impressions made into underlying dimensions. And when he did so, he found two dimensions emerging. The first is better captured by the idea of valence. I'm going to use trustworthiness as a shorthand here because that's the judgment that best corresponds when people are asked to make ratings. But it's essentially this idea of whether or not someone has good or bad intentions towards you. The second dimension he called dominance, and he suggested was to do with someone's capability in carrying out those intentions. So these faces are my own, taken from my own work, and they illustrate endpoints of these dimensions. They're actually composite faces, and they're composite faces taken from a database of 1,000 original real images. They're very, very variable. The composites look quite clear, but actually the images going in are very variable. And they show the 20 faces that are essentially highest and lowest on each of these dimensions. And there's two reasons I'm showing you these images. First, we can use them then in follow-up experimental studies where we essentially look to see if people actually do find the same impressions that we hypothesized in these dimensions, which we do, and also because they give you a sense of the wide variety of different facial cues people are using. So you can see, for example, that emotional expression seems to be very important, especially for something like trust. It's not the only important cue, though. There's influences from gender stereotyping, which we heard about in the talks earlier. So, for example, the more trustworthy looking face looks female. So this model started off by suggesting that impressions are important or functional because they help us judge threat. If you're meeting someone for the first time down one of Aberdeen's many dark alleyways, then you might need to know if this is someone who looks untrustworthy and is best avoided. And again, I'm not trying to say this is necessarily accurate, it's just a judgment that people might be making in lieu of having any other information. So since then, and this is older work now, I used this larger database of faces and actually found that 3 dimensions emerged. And I'm just showing you here that it was actually a factor analysis, but the same idea. We have traits here that participants rate, and we put them into this dimensional reduction technique, and we get out dimensions. Actually, they happen to look like trustworthiness and dominance, and also something that looked a little bit different, which I'm just going to show you again, the faces on the endpoints. Representing something that was actually qualitatively very different from threat. So this seemed instead to capture something about perceptions of age twinned with decreasing or increasing attractiveness with younger age. So my main point here is that with the images that we used, they had a much larger variation on age. They were more naturalistic in this particular study. We found that 2 dimensions alone were not enough to account for the variance. Actually, I was still impressed, and still am today, by how well this did replicate considering the images that we used. Since then, and you'll see some of this in some of the studies I present today, I think the idea of dominance itself is often quite problematic, so participants often don't spontaneously mention it. Perhaps something like general capability is a better way of thinking about this dimension. So I think Alex's model often gets a little bit misunderstood. People like to focus on these two dimensions and on the idea of threat. But actually, I think the most important insight from his model was really just the idea that these impressions are functional for our social behaviour. We use them to guide our decisions. And again, I don't mean necessarily accurate. I mean, a good way to think about these judgments, I think, is a kind of visual stereotype. So we use them in the same way that we use other stereotypes. But if these impressions are functional, then this kind of very threat-related context should not be the only place in which we see these judgments emerging, and they shouldn't necessarily always look exactly the same. And that was the insight provided by, this is Gemma Colliva. She's a former PhD student and postdoc of mine, and she was really interested in the idea of testing this idea of functionality using faces that would be not at all threatening to us. So she looked at impressions of children's faces, and one of the reviewers did make us justify that children's faces are less threatening, which we did, but there we go. So she looked at this here in the same kind of paradigm where you get people to make spontaneous impressions, and this is some of the judgments that people say. We were also really worried about this starting off, that people would only just mention nice things about the children's faces, and as it turns out, that was not a concern. So here is a word cloud that summarises the descriptions made by our participants. I'm very keen on these because I think it keeps us as true as possible to the original data, and the larger the word, the more frequently people mention that kind of trait. She then took those words, boiled them down to a set of more tractable trait words and had them rated for a larger set of the children's faces, and these are the dimensions that emerged when she carried out dimensional reduction analysis. And again, they're composites. That also allows us to preserve the identity of the individuals going into this. So again, you can see there's maybe something about emotional expression, although these faces were a lot more emotionally neutral. We actually did replicate this model with more variable images as well. We started off with a more controlled database. But what she found is that two dimensions emerged, the first being niceness and the second being shyness. And you might be asking yourself, well, is this essentially trustworthiness and dominance again? And to some extent, yes, because the first dimension, when we correlated this with other traits like trustworthiness, we did find a very high overlap. You can see here, it's not showing, but you can see on the top bar of this heat map, that's the correlations here. The second dimension, however, didn't really look especially like dominance. And that was actually what we predicted, because across all of the studies that I've run or seen, typically the first dimension, this idea of valence, is the most robust. And then after that, it starts to get a little bit more variable. So why are impressions from faces important? Well, they're easy to make, and they're functional in the sense that they have important consequences. So even though they're superficial, that's why I find them really interesting to study. Okay, so now I'd like to go on to the main part of my talk, which is to really talk about how we might differ in the impressions that we make. Starting off with impressions across culture. And I was really interested in this because at the time that I carried out these studies, the field had really described impressions as being universal. That was kind of the starting point. So I wanted to know, well, do we see the same spontaneous impressions across culture? And do we see the same dimensions emerging? And at this point, I'd really like to thank the students who were integral to the work. So Celia, Christy, and Lindsay, without whom this study really wouldn't have been possible. So again, we start by just showing people pictures of faces and getting them to write whatever comes to mind. We do this across culture, and everything is kept as close to within culture as possible. So the experimenters are from the culture of origin that the faces are from, and the language is used in that same culture as well, and that's really important, I think. We then look to see what the profile of descriptions were that people made. And you can see that the profile is actually very similar. So in particular, people mentioned across both cultures traits 30% of the time. And I should say, so we focused here on two cultures. We focused on Britain and China. Of course, this question is much larger than any two cultures. We chose these cultures because we thought we would have, I guess, they were different enough that we would be able to see differences if they were important. And these word clouds here again show you the descriptions our participants gave. And just as a reminder, this data from Chinese is translated, so that's just for our convenience. I definitely had a point though in this study where I got back the free descriptions in Chinese and thought, what have I done? So it was really a team effort to kind of look through this. And I should also say as well, we were talking about the importance of sampling stimuli earlier on too. So in this study, we tried really hard to make sure that the images were chosen such that they were as variable as possible across both cultures, so both the Chinese faces and the British faces. We had pilot raters from multiple different cultures look at these two sets of images. So these word clouds here might look superficially different, but actually there's a lot of commonality in meanings, and bearing in mind again the translation. So for example, friendly, kind, benevolent, cheerful, outgoing, that could also be translated as like warm, kind and gentle, treacherous. These are all very much in line with this valence or trustworthiness idea. And then there's some hint that there's maybe also something about capability, so intelligent, capable, experienced. Our participants didn't spontaneously mention dominance at all. People did also mention attractiveness a lot of the time. We coded this here as an appearance description. It's a bit debatable whether or not it's actually a character trait as such. I always find this a really intriguing question. I'm happy to talk about that later, but participants certainly mentioned it. So what did we find? Oh yes, so I guess what I should say as well, then in the second phase of research, we got the most frequently mentioned traits, and we had new participants then rate not just faces from their own culture, as in the qualitative study, but also faces across culture for the traits that were most frequently mentioned by their own culture. So the British participants here would rate the faces on kindness because that was mentioned frequently, and actually it was mentioned frequently by the Chinese participants too, and so they also rated the faces on this trait here. A much larger database now of faces. So we actually found that there's a difference in the overall dimensions. So looking first of all at the British perceivers, we find 3 dimensions emerging for own ethnicity faces, and actually only 2 dimensions emerging for other ethnicity faces. In particular, what happened is that this kind of capability dimension got a little bit lost. So we still see something about trustworthiness, we still saw something about attractiveness, capability got a bit lost. And actually the pattern was the same, although the dimensions slightly differed when we looked at the Chinese participants. So now we see 4 dimensions emerging for the own ethnicity faces, and that drops down to 3 for the other ethnicity faces. And in particular, what seems to happen is that youthfulness and attractiveness seems to split in this group here. We think that might have to do with the participants and the region of China that they specifically came from originally. So in this region, there are still quite important connotations around like benevolence or wisdom. Older age is seen as more positive perhaps than it might be for at least the participants we tested in the UK. So perhaps that becomes more important when they're looking at faces they're more familiar with. Okay, that difference aside, I have given the dimensions very similar labels, right? So in particular, the first dimension was always something like trustworthiness. So because everyone rated all of the faces, we can actually correlate at the level of the faces across perceiver culture. So in other words, we can look at the British and Chinese perceivers and ask directly how similar are these dimensions. And when we do that, we actually find that the correlations are reasonably high. So in particular for something like trustworthiness, that's around about 0.9. That's probably its ceiling, especially considering that our participants were actually making these judgments in different languages and the traits themselves were slightly different. And this similarity doesn't, I guess, whether or not you look at dimensions, you can just look at the original traits rated themselves. So this heat map here shows the absolute correlation. So 0 is no correlation at all. Increasing towards the darker blue means an absolute correlation of 1. And you can see that there's the British perceiver impressions here and the Chinese perceiver impressions along the horizontal. And they're structured here in order of importance that I guess the factor analysis draws out. So what that means to say is that you can see that there's this large cluster here across culture between all of these kind of warmth, friendly related type traits. And that's essentially showing the dimensional structure in this heat map here. There's also a smaller but distinct correlation or set of correlations between age and attractiveness. And then there's a bit of a hint, but it kind of gets a little bit harder to see towards capability and intelligence. That was for the white faces here. If we look at the Asian faces, actually, we see a very similar pattern, and same thing for the correlations. So because of this high cross-cultural agreement, once we abstract over the differences in the number of dimensions, we put everything into one overall pan-cultural model. So that's now from every culture, like both British and Chinese perceivers. And that model is more stable because there's just more data going into it. It seems to settle in 3 dimensions for each of these 2 groups. So I asked if there's similarity across culture or not, and then I showed you evidence that there is and is not. So what's going on here? I think the way I would best capture it, and we heard, of course, from another speaker as well, talking about cultural differences, but I think what we see is really broad agreement across culture. But within that, and we drew on this concept from the cross-cultural field of veriform universality, impressions themselves would differ to the extent that threats and opportunities offered by people from different cultures also differ. Or another way of thinking about this, maybe that's more intuitive if you think about language, is just the idea that there might be cultural dialects in our impressions from faces. In particular, there's an intriguing hint that people might just be a bit more sensitive to impressions when they're looking at faces that are more familiar. So potentially, yes, we do see some evidence of cultural differences. These take on the form of dialects. I'm now going to look at the developmental origins of impressions. Okay, so when we started this work, there was a couple of lines of evidence already. I'm going to just draw on a few here. So first of all, there's some really elegant work looking at pre-verbal infants that showed that the infants were sensitive to trustworthiness and attractiveness cues in faces. So this was measured by preferential looking paradigms, where you could see that the infants would look longer at the faces that adults had chosen to be more trustworthy or to be more attractive looking. Of course, because they're pre-verbal infants, that means that it's very difficult to get beyond that. I mean, in the sense that you can't ask the infants what it is they're actually doing. That makes it a bit difficult to unpack. But certainly by the age that children are about 3 years old, they can agree at least on their impressions of whether or not an adult's face looks nice or mean with adults as well. Actually, the story gets a bit more complicated when we look at dominance, but I'm happy to circle back around that. And then we've done some work on this too, where by the age of 10, if you look at children's impressions as a group, they agree very strongly with adults' niceness impressions of the same faces. That's across a number of different studies. But there's a bit of a twist here. So if you ask the question a different way, instead of asking whether or not there just, is any agreement at all, if you ask when do children's impressions become adult-like, then you can actually see evidence of developmental change. This is Saba Sadiq. She's just about to do her Viva in another couple of weeks. And this is one of the papers from her PhD, where she ran a meta-analysis comparing lots of studies in the field that had compared children and adults directly. So this line here shows an effect size where the children and adults don't differ, and it's sorted by different groups of children's ages, in as much as we could do that based on the papers. So that you can see that at under 5, the children actually do disagree with the adults, and that pattern only changes as children approach the age of 10. So we think that there's this critical period in middle childhood where actually impressions are still showing developmental change, And that contrasts, I guess, with the early emergence of these impressions. They're not fully mature yet. So what's going on? Well, the chance to give this talk was really useful for me to reflect a little bit on what I think might be happening. And I think there's a number of different things that could be happening. So first of all, we could see differences in children's general cognitive development or their understanding of traits. We know that that changes across the same time. What I would say is that most of the studies, if not all of them, did control for the children's understanding of the experimental conditions. So they understood that they were, what trustworthiness was after the fact of rating the faces. Of course, we're making judgments from faces. There's lots of visual changes that occur in that time too. There could be something more or less specific to faces. It could be general changes in visual perception in general. We've heard from the different symposia today the importance of social experience, and I'm going to come back to that in the end of my talk too. And I've just touched on the idea that there could be cultural dialects and impressions, so cultural experience could also be important too. So today I'm just going to focus on one of these potential mechanisms, looking at general visual and face perception changes. And there's lots and lots of different ways we could have done this. This is the way that we started off by looking at it. We started off by looking at it with this technique called fast visual periodic stimulation. And before I start talking about the children, I'm just going to talk about the paradigm in general with adults. This is work from my PhD student, Derek Sway, who took this technique that, of course, Bruno Rossian has used for many different aspects of face perception, and here we're looking at trustworthiness. So let me talk you through the paradigm. The way the paradigm goes, and you'll see that these faces are very controlled, that's because we're going to be interested in any kind of visual change, and so we have to be really careful to control the images. So that's a bit of a departure from my work, which normally uses very unconstrained images. So we show faces really, really rapidly at a rate of 6 Hertz. And within this visual stream of faces, we systematically change the trustworthiness of the faces. So in other words, every 6 faces, people see an oddball, which is either trustworthy after seeing lots of untrustworthy faces, or vice versa. So there's a general sequence of 6 Hertz, and then the important thing is that at 1 Hertz, trustworthiness changes. And then as a control as well, we've got inverted faces, which are the same but inverted. And while participants are looking at this, they're asked to do some kind of incidental task. For example, in this particular experiment, we got them to look at a fixation cross change so that they're maintaining visual, attention to the faces, but without asking them about trustworthiness. And we're also recording EEG at the same time. And we take that EEG data and we Fourier transform it so that we're looking at the frequency domain. And what we're interested in finding is if we can see a signal corresponding to this change in trustworthiness introduced by the oddball. So this is what we see. I'll start with the inverted faces, but basically this is just the response to the stimulus changing, like any face coming on. You see that in both inverted and then upright faces here. And then more importantly, at this frequency of 1 Hertz after this fast Fourier transform, we see a corresponding amplitude as well. Both at the fundamental frequency and also at the corresponding harmonics, so every Hertz after that, that's quite typical of this paradigm. And we find these changes occurring over our region of interest, which is over right occipital temporal cortex. So that was with adults. Now we're applying this to look at the differences or to compare children and adults. And so we do this for, and I guess our prediction here is that we should see it for adults. We also thought we probably should see something for children because there are studies, of course, showing that we can see impressions in children. And we were interested to know how similar it was. And that's what we exactly see. So we replicate the effect for adults, and then we also see this in children as well. And these are the heat maps here. So again, this is just taken by looking to see where in the brain this is occurring, at least at the level of the scalp. So let me talk through the similarities and differences. Similarities, we do see a significant response at the fundamental frequency, at least for the upright faces for both children and adults. And this effect size is larger for the upright condition than the inverted condition, exactly as we predicted. We looked at using Bayesian analysis because actually we were really interested in whether the children and adults were similar or different. So we used Bayesian analysis to be able to look at that. And we did actually find similar strength of response in the two groups. And that was a strong evidence with the Bayesian analysis. But the eagle-eyed of you will have seen that there were also some differences too. So probably most intriguingly, for the children, we actually saw that the response was more strongly clustered at this fundamental frequency. And we're not the first people to show this, so there aren't that many studies using FPVS in children yet, but this study here looked at face detection, also found a similar profile. We don't really know yet why that occurs. It could be something for the task itself, it could be something to do like with faces or their processing. It could be something to do with physiological changes that occur with myelination. It could be age-related thickening of the skull. We're not really sure yet, but we're not the first to observe this. We also see a response to inverted faces for children only, and that seems to suggest, to us at least, that this response here is less face selective in children than it is for adults. It seems to be a bit more general to the visual stimulus change. And you'll have seen, of course, in this heat map that it appears that the activation is perhaps more is less lateralized in the children. Actually, this difference isn't significant when we compare directly. It's not something we predicted beforehand or pre-registered or anything like that. So I guess the jury's still a little bit out on this. And it could be real, it could be epiphenomenon, but we do see that it seems to be more distributed. So in terms of thinking about the origins of impressions, potentially we do see either general or perhaps more specifically to face trust, changes in perception here that could be explaining this developmental trend. That is far from the whole story. So I really want to emphasize at this point that all of these other mechanisms are going to be really important to study as well. So I'm just really excited to see what we find with this actually, because I think there's lots of different routes and different mechanisms by which we see this development through childhood. So, in terms of the developmental origins of impressions, we found a pattern of early emergence, but later maturation. So children's impressions are not mature until around 10 years old. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about individual differences in impressions. You've probably heard this phrase before. It's certainly not difficult to find online motivational quotes that cite this. So this is one of my favourites, and of course Scottish philosopher David Hume famously thought that there was no such thing as objective beauty that we could see from, outside in the world, that it is wholly a subjective standard. So was he right? Well, we took an empirical look at this question, and this is in collaboration with some folks in the States. So Eric Heyman was the first author. And we looked at this question by crucially just getting participants to come in and give us impressions 2 times. So they saw the same faces more than once. And by doing that, we could then look to see, okay, the variation in the impression judgments made, how much of that variation was due to the faces themselves, and that's pretty much everything I've been covering in the talk so far. How much was due to a main effect of the observer. So one way of thinking about this might be for attractiveness, for example. We might just have completely different standards of what we think of as attractive. You might be very, very picky, I might be very liberal, and so we might disagree. It's hard to know if this is an effect of the observer is really genuinely about a first impression of the face as such, because it could also be a difference in scale use, so we might just use scales differently. So that one's a little bit harder to unpack. But I think most interesting for present purposes is this idea of the interaction between the face and the observer. So you can think about this kind of like the eye of the beholder effect. So a way of thinking about this intuitively for something like attractiveness might be, you might find brown eyes very attractive, I might find blue eyes very attractive, and so we disagree. And that's what we were really interested in quantifying here. So we looked at this for traits along youthfulness and attractiveness. We partitioned the variance using a multi-level model so that we could see how much variation is due to each of these different factors. And what we find is if you ignore the effect of the observer that's a bit harder to pin down, it's about 50-50. So the proportion of variance conveyed by the face is actually only about 50% of the variation that exists there. I think that's one of the reasons why people have been arguing over this question for so long, because you can really argue about it. That we're not the first people to show this. So there's a really lovely paper from 2006 that showed a very similar thing using a slightly different method, and Laura Germain's done work on this too. We then took this further and looked to see, okay, for these judgments that are more subjective, perhaps, how much variation is due here, and actually it's even more due to the perceiver then. So the importance of the face seems to be less. Okay, well, of course, that got me thinking further. So where do these individual differences come from? What are the origins of these? And again, there's lots of different ways that you could think about looking at that question, and we heard about some of them today. And the way we chose to look at this is to look at understanding if this variation comes from somehow internally our genes or to do with the environments that we're in. So we tested this using classic twin design, where we tested over 1,000 twin individuals. And we built a test of their subjective impressions of trustworthiness. So remember that I said that trustworthiness itself doesn't have very good ground truth. So that makes it a little bit harder to construct a test. What we did is we looked to see how well people agreed with impressions that people made on average. So that was our test. And when I say people, specifically what we did is we got monozygotic and dizygotic twin pairs, so identical and non-identical twin pairs, and we compare them because, of course, the idea here is that if we look at identical twins, they share on average 100% of their variation in terms of genes, and if we look at the non-identical twins, they share on average 50% of their genetic variation, and we can compare them. We predicted actually that we would find a contribution of the environment for reasons I'll come back to. But before I talk about our results, I just want to give credit here to Nicola Burton. This was a logistically very challenging study because you need people to come in and then you need their twin to also take part in this research. And then we need to keep track of who's taken part and so on and so forth. And that gives you a sense of our kind of sampling flow here. We actually, to go out to get our sample of over 1,000 people, we had to approach over 12,000 individuals. So that full credit goes to Nicola for managing this recruitment method. So what do we see? Well, I'm going to just look at the correlations here because I think they're relatively intuitive. So here are the identical twins and here are the non-identical twins in purple. And what we would expect to see if there was some kind of strong genetic component is that the identical twins should be twice as similar than the non-identical twins. That's not what we see. So instead, these correlations are pretty much entirely overlapping. Knowing whether or not the twins are identical is not buying you that much. We look at this with more complicated multi-level twin models. This is just an example here. And by doing this more complicated modelling, what we can do is partition the variance not just due to the genetics of the twins, but also due to the fact that twins are raised in families. So we can compare whether or not sources of environmental variation are basically shared or unique to the twins. And that's what we do. And when we do this, we find that actually the most important component is this contribution of the unique personal environment, not really the shared environment. So what do we think is going on? Well, we think that as you're going through the world, encountering different people, you're learning unique attributions, I guess, of who looks friendly or who looks unfriendly to you, and that's driving your impressions, these unique social encounters. I should say, though, that there was a component of genetic variation, so around 20%, and that obviously also needs to be understood and followed up on. We also look to see, okay, well, how similar are the contributions of genetics and environment across different impressions, because we had trustworthiness, dominance, and also attractiveness. And we look to see their correlations with emotion and identity. Sadly, not with the twins. This is with a different sample here. And what we find is that although the individual tests of these impressions are themselves reliable, they're quite distinctive. So they don't really correlate that much across different impressions. There's maybe something between trustworthiness and attractiveness, but that's about it. And also distinct from emotion and identity. And because we have the twins taking part in multiple tests of impressions, we can also look to see, well, are the sources of environmental and genetic variation unique to the different impressions that are being formed, or is there somehow something common to each of these different impressions? And actually what we find is that, without going into too much of the detail, really we're getting distinctive patterns of environmental variation driving variation in each of these impressions. So another way to think about this is really that if we're going through the world getting experience with people that's changing our perceptions, that experience is different for the different traits. It's not like some kind of overall halo effect or something like that. So actually this effect here of a strong component of environmental variation is really intriguing because if we look at what happens for face identity recognition, that is very strongly genetically driven. So here are two papers that are on that topic. And actually, because Laura Javine and Jeremy Wilmer were collaborators on the work I'm presenting just now, we could also look at this using their estimates from their previous studies. So Jeremy had looked at identity and Laura had looked at attractiveness. And you can see that we essentially replicate Laura's earlier attractiveness result. That's why we hypothesized that indeed impressions would be very driven by environmental variation. But that looks in sharp contrast to identity recognition, which is just showing a completely different profile. And this is just another way of looking at the same thing, actually. So here's the correlations again. Sometimes they're a bit more intuitive. So identical twins, non-identical twins, not much difference between them in terms of these subjective social judgments and faces. For identity, it's clear that the identical twins are much more similar than the non-identical twins. So in terms of individual differences in impressions, I think that these are actually really critical. And I guess I don't want to belabor the point too much because one of the things that really intrigues us about impression formation is just the idea that when we look at a face and we have an immediate perception that someone is untrustworthy or not, that can be shared across individuals. So that seemed like a very useful starting place for the field, and I think it was a really good place to start. But we do see that there are individual differences, and I think the time's come to really understand these more fully, especially also their links to experience. So in terms of conclusions and future directions, well, I hope I've convinced you that impressions from faces are important. They're easy to make, they have important social consequences, and for that reason we should care about them. There's broad agreement in impressions, but I think it's really important that we understand now variation due to culture, development, and particularly individual differences, actually. So in terms of future directions, I'll just sketch out a few that we've been looking at here. Andy and I have just published a response to reviewers from a commentary that we published in the British Journal of Psychology, and that was a very constructive and really interesting, I guess, set of papers. But one of the things that came out of this that I think is truly important is just that we increase the diversity in the faces and participants that we're using. And that was also a bit of a theme of the symposia workshops as well, I saw. I think it's also very clear from both the symposia workshops and just really everything we've heard today that it's time also to expand beyond the face. So groups, voices, bodies, gestures, environment, symbolic cues and goals. And if you're interested in finding out some more of the work that we've been doing on this, Fiammetta has a poster in the next session, so you can go and have a chat with her. We've also been doing some work on gestures too. I think it's really intriguing to think about this middle childhood period, and certainly working through this talk has given me pause for thought as to, well, what is happening with the children? And that's something we've been interested in following up on too, looking particularly at gender stereotyping, so I'm happy to talk about that at the end if you're interested. I also think it's really intriguing, and there aren't very many studies looking at this period after childhood. So what about adolescence, where we know that people's social environments change radically? How does that shape impression formation? And I don't have a good answer for you for that. And of course, if social experience is driving impressions, as we think it is from the twin work that we're doing, well, where are we getting this social experience from? And we heard today from some of the symposia talks, some of the kinds of social experience that might be important. We've also been really interested in the idea of understanding how do we learn impressions, how do we translate these to faces that we've never seen before. And if you're interested in looking at or hearing more about our work there, then also Leonie has a poster on that to you in the session next, so you can have a chat with her as well. And finally, I'm still really interested in the idea of integrating impression formation, I guess, in general, with more classic face perception abilities. So I'm very lucky to be part of a grant collaboration where that's my little piece of the grant, to look at the integration between these different things. So for now, I'm just going to say thank you very much for inviting me and for listening to me talk. And thanks to all of the funders, of course, and the participants and everyone who makes this research work. And I'm very happy to take any questions.
Well, that was an absolutely beautiful talk. And I talked about the creativity at the beginning and the breadth, and I think we got a taste of that tonight. And I think what I hadn't really appreciated was also just the ambition. You know, the twin study was just amazing. So well done. I mean, I'm really looking forward to hearing more about the individual differences path and the way that this accumulates over experience. So thank you very much for such a terrific talk. So we do have some time for questions. Would anyone like to start us off?
While we do that, I'm just going to put up a sneaky advert. ECBP is coming to Aberdeen, so you're cordially invited.
Good opportunity. So who wants to start? And we'll just wait for the microphone as well. Yeah, up at the back.
Thank you. I was thinking about the twin study, where you could flip on its head, rather than looking at what separately the twins have faces, whether you could look at whether ratings of twins themselves are quite different or quite similar. So my wife's an identical twin, and people will comment on the fact that the twins must look the same. I'm like, no, they don't. They've got different haircuts. They sort of hold themselves differently. So I wondered whether people would rate them quite differently if you showed them photos.
Yeah, I don't know. I would love that we had the foresight to ask the twins to give us a photograph. we didn't, so that would require a completely new collection. But yeah, that's an intriguing idea. I wonder how much familiarity would play a role there, because I would imagine that would be a really strong factor contributing. It would be so fascinating to compare strangers and very familiar people and every degree in between. Thank you.
Any other questions? David. Let's do pass the parcel here.
Thanks, that was indeed a lovely talk. I just want to go back to something you said right at the outset about how these quite immediate impressions of trustworthiness or attractiveness can apparently bias judgments about whether a suspect is guilty or something like that in a consequential situation. And I'm just wondering how meaningful those findings are. I'm thinking about the parallel findings that you see about gender. So, these instantaneous judgments of gender, which seem to affect somebody's judgment about whether they would hire a person to be a researcher in their lab, that kind of thing. In that domain, it's very clear that you get those effects when really gender is the only cue that's available, more or less the only cue. But as you make the task more realistic, you give more information on which the individual could base their judgment. Then the effects of these cues seem to be washed out almost completely. And I wonder whether that's possible in those studies that you were referring to as well.
Well, I guess there's a couple of things. So one of the studies Anna and I are running looks at the effect of first impressions on in effect, hiring decisions, and that we do see still that the photograph plays a role. I guess in the studies where there's a link made between a first impression from a photograph, the predictions are real world predictions, like voting predictions, for example. That's real world data. So no doubt there's lots of things that intervene in between the photograph and the ultimate decision of someone to go to the ballot. But in many cases, I think you're seeing the photograph at a time point where you might not have any other information. So for example, those studies have shown the strongest effects are on voters who don't yet have a voting preference. That makes a lot of sense. If you already know you're going to vote whichever party you're going to vote for, it really wouldn't matter which photograph you see. But there are countries where the photographs are on the ballots. And definitely you see pictures of candidates' faces as you approach a ballot. And I think there are a lot of undecided voters who maybe don't really have a strong impression. So no doubt the information surrounding the face would make a difference. But I think in a number of quite important occasions it might not. So the other work I'm thinking of here is from Dong-Won Oh, so he can probably explain better himself. But looking at whether or not people stop using these judgments if they're paid to do so. And it's not always possible to stop someone from using these judgments. People will pay money to see a face when there's actually really no essential value in the experiment to having a picture.
Anyone else? No?
Thanks. Yes, I echo what everyone else said. Really enjoyed the talk. Thanks. My point really relates to David's actually, and it's on the possible transience of these. So another route to what David was saying is that, okay, you're talking about first impressions, and many of these studies actually have very brief presentation times, and then which actually isn't the norm in how you form impressions when there's time to change that. The sort of hint that there's something ephemeral there is the link that you pointed out so strongly between some of these impressions and emotional expression, which of course is very transient. So what's the point of a system that drives you to a first impression based on an emotional expression?
No, it's a fair question. So there's a couple of things. The first is I think we need a really good set of studies that probe at that question. So if you're reviewing my next grant, please give us the money to do that. But you also would have really enjoyed Mila's talk. So she was looking at overriding impression from a face with a voice, and I think it can definitely happen. I think that my best answer to that question really is that often I don't think these systems are designed to form impressions. I think these are systems designed to do something completely different, like look for an emotional expression, and we're applying it in the wrong context. It's like something I've thought about before in this context is almost like an allergy. It's something related from, I guess, a capability that might be useful when there is genuinely an emotional expression there, but when there's not, you're just kind of applying this in circumstances where it's actually not helpful. So I think in a sense, these impressions are often byproducts of something that could be useful, and this is the consequence. There were actually some earlier studies which I would really love to revisit, where they looked at impressions of college tutors at the beginning of the year and then eventual college like ratings of those college tutors, and they did find a link there. So I don't know if that's because we carry it as a sort of prior and then it influences our subsequent interactions, or yeah, it would be interesting to probe at that further. But if you're asking what the function of these impressions are, I think they're coming from something else that's more helpful, and this is just being, in a sense, misapplied.
Right, last one from Heather. Just wait for the microphone. Down here.
To clarify, the question's not from me, it's from our online audience. So I have a question from Luke Woodson online asking about the time course of first impression formation. So from first seeing a face, how quickly do people make the first impression?
Well, I guess it depends on how you phrase the question. So there's been lots of studies showing that you can make an impression from a very, very short amount of information. So even in some studies as low as 35 milliseconds of information, like a face basically shown for 35 milliseconds, that's enough to make an impression that agrees with impressions made under unconstrained time. And we saw that as well from a really lovely talk earlier about voices, the same was true. That's maybe a bit different to asking how quick the reaction time is. And actually, Andy Young's previous PhD student, Isabel Santos, she looked at that in her PhD thesis. It's also very, very quick, but don't ask me how much it is off the top of my head. But certainly we don't need much information. They are very first impressions.
Okay, we could do a final one. Yeah, right. Yeah.
I'm not sure I understand.
Just get the AI to answer my questions, really.
One final question.
Hi Claire, thank you for a really interesting talk. I was just wondering, you've been talking about impressions coming from faces. Have people compared the effect of faces versus other features that we might use, like hairstyle and clothing and things, and the relative importance of that?
Yeah, so I guess a lot of the talks in the symposium earlier focused on various aspects of combinations of faces and voices, and I don't want to speak for other people, so I'll just say that the face is clearly not the only thing going on. In terms of, so another thing that's really interesting to me in this field and something that I've worked on as well is just, we know that impressions of the same individual can vary a lot photograph to photograph. So it's possible to choose two photographs of two people that completely reverse the impression made. So when I'm talking about first impressions from faces, I'm really talking about first impressions from face images. And in many circumstances, that is the important thing. I mean, these days, with so much of our world's online, it's perhaps the first thing you see. It could be the only thing you ever see about someone. But in a real-life social interaction, of course, that's not the only information we have. And this is just a really intriguing question, because I don't know that we need to predict that the face is the only, certainly not the only thing, perhaps not even the most important thing. But face images, certainly we see those everywhere now, and that's really where I'm also interested in.
Okay, I think that we should bring this session to a close.